That's Dr. Mike Kudish. He was a professor up at Paul Smith's College for many years.
Where we were on, Mike, that would help.
And he came retired, and he has come back to, he says, finish his thesis 60 years later or whatever it is. But it's always a treat to hear Mike speak and learn a little bit about his latest discoveries. So Mike, it's all yours. Thank you.
First, I have to get into CFA proper uniform. So on goes the shirt, which by the way has the start times for the 3 previous lectures. And this is the latest of the start times. So let me put this on. There it goes. That's only half the uniform. No, it's a third. Wait a minute, I gotta be properly attired here. Oh, come on, come on, come on. Don't tell me I need a bunch of graduate students to pull a t-shirt down. There we go. Okay. And now the hat. I don't know if I need to wear the pack. It's a CFA pack. So, okay. Now, let's see. I've been apprehensive about this for 6 months. Turning the light bulb on, and it won't light because it already had its last chance. What I'm going to speak about is a rather complicated topic, and when I spoke to Frank about it earlier in the summer, he thought it might be a good idea because it combines all kinds of things. People who are interested in the industrial aspects of forestry and people who are interested in the ecological and the historical all in one. And I want to, let's see if this will work. Well, let's see it stays. Focus? Is it focus for you? Because I'm used to it. Tell me when it's good focus.
Looks good. Looks great.
Okay,
right there.
here's my outline. Well, wait now. Whoa, can I turn this around?
You can take that speaker off.
Oh. I'm going to derail on this and I'll have a derailment. Okay, oh, all right. I can barely see it. Okay, that's for me. I want to tell you where the idea came from. Can you all hear me? Okay, where the idea came for this presentation, I live up in the Dry Brook Valley, which is just a few miles from here. And since I was a graduate student, I have some dear friends up the valley, the Bakers, Larry and Betty and Laurie, and they have been helping me over the decades with lots and lots of detail on the mills, which were up in the Dry Brook Valley. And you would think, well, it's just a rural valley. Yeah, but there were close to 20 mills on that valley, not all operating at the same time. And I always wondered where they were and when they ran and what they manufactured. And then when Betty and Laurie Baker gave me a tour last spring of the upper end of the Dry Brook Valley to see where a lot of these mills were, not all of them, but as many as we could, it occurred to me that one of the major products that the mills were producing was piano bars. Not the only product of many, but a major one. Not all the mills produced it, but many of them did. And piano bars, as far as I can figure out, are these connecting rods that will connect a ivory key, what people play on, with the strings, the hammers on the strings of these long wooden bars inside the piano. And I was wondering, piano bars, they use special grade of sugar maple for that. So I began to think, what about the distribution of sugar maple at the head of the Dry Brook watershed in relation to the sawmills? That is, did the sawmills stop with the logging roads where the sugar maple stopped, and above that would be all original growth forest that has never been logged or cut or barked or burned or farmed, and without sugar maple? Well, it turned out that this is not true, and it's far more complicated than I thought, and I just want to share some of it with you. I'm speaking off the cuff here without even reading my outline, but I'll go through the outline to make sure I've got everything. And what I was thinking of doing and ran out of time because I was preparing furiously for this presentation as late as Thursday and working on the maps on and off since last April to try to get them to be ready. And what I need to do is to make a large table, a paper table, not a wooden table, with the sawmill and the dates of operation and the products and the location in a chronological sequence to see which ones were first and which ones were last, when they operated, what they produced, and where they operated, to try to get more sense out of it. I haven't had time to do that. Let's see what this is. The idea, major product, we did that. As far as mapping the logging roads and the stumps, a number of years ago I had permission from Mr. Gould, Kingdon Gould. He and I had a discussion, an oral discussion, not by writing, and he gave me permission to explore much of the land, which was his. Of course, some of it is state land higher up. So I had the opportunity to explore and map a lot of the log road systems and the stumps. So you'll see it on the big map in a few minutes. And the question I have down here is, could the log roads have ended where sugar maple ended? In other words, no roads extended above where the sugar maple stopped, and it's all first growth forest above. Well, it isn't quite that simple. Results over here. What do you see about the high elevation sugar maple groves? What do you see about that? The CFA News, Catskill Forest Association newsletter for the fall, it's not out yet as far as I know. It should be out any day now. And in it I have an article called Sugar Shale Sandwiches. And it's about sugar maple distribution high up on the slopes. And I look at them as sandwiches. And a little bit, maybe I should tell you about that now. Wait, we have some distraction in the back. Okay, sugar shale sandwiches. What happens is that most of the sugar maple is down low, that is below, say, 25, 26, 2,700 feet, in an almost continuous forest of sugar maple mixed with other species. There are only a few places where sugar maple won't grow, like in a swamp or on top of a bedrock ledge or something like that. But most of the forest is sugar maple up to, let's say, 26, 27, 2,800 feet. Above that, for the most part, where the soils are thinner and hold less water and are more rocky, you have a different kind of forest. It's mostly yellow birch mixed in with what I call ridge hardwoods. That would be beech, black cherry, red maple, mountain ash, and a whole array of shrubs. And that would be above where the sugar maple is abundant. But then if you're climbing up many of these slopes, I'll show you on the big map in a few minutes, something strange happens when sometimes you get up even 3,500, 3,300 feet, 3,200 feet. You think, my gosh, I'm out of sugar maple, I'm into the birch forest. If in certain places you'll have balsam fir growing with it, in other places you won't. Of all things, you're back in sugar maple again. Now what is going on here? You're down in sugar maple in the valleys, you think you're out of it, climbing up the mountainsides, you go into this birch, ridge hardwood scrub forest, sometimes with balsam, then you're back into sugar maple. Is the sugar maple going to go all the way to the top of the mountain at 35, 36, 37, 3,800 feet? The answer is no. The sugar maple stops and then you're back into the ridge hardwood, yellow birch, balsam fir forest. What is going on here? Let's see what I have here. Okay, we'll talk a little about that. Let me get the maps going. Let me show you one map. And then we'll put the big one on. Let's see if this is upside down. Well, you love that. Okay. Here's the Dry Brook Valley. And where's my pointer? Oh. This map is kind of a watered down version of this map, which has a lot more detail on it and is of a larger scale. And if you want a larger scale yet, where do you see what's coming? So here's the Dry Brook Valley. Is that in focus? I'm so nearsighted, I have to focus it for me, and it may not be good for you.
We're okay.
Okay. These squares are mills. Let me get a little bit here. From what I can gather, there were 5 of them running in 1869 in the town of Middletown, where we are now in Delaware County. That is at the lower end of the Dry Brook Valley. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I didn't compile detail on those yet. And then when you get upstream into Hardenburg in Ulster County, you have a lot more. And that's what a lot of these dots are, these little squares. And some of the open boxes, those are individual mills. I don't have the time to go into the detail of every mill. I do have the approximate dates for some of them. And what I want to do is really spend time showing you the big map. But you see the mills went all the way up. And the uppermost mill was Gormley's Upper Mill, which is above the Shandaken Brook confluence. And if you hiked all the trails in there and know that area, that's pretty far up. And the mills were scattered all the way up from the county line all the way up to above the Shandaken Brook. And some of those mills, which I can't understand, were on tributaries, and how they got enough water in those tributaries, but they must have. The Baker Mill up in Ryder Hollow, the Cook Mill in Haynes Hollow. There was a mill up in, wait a minute, where's the Drury? Up in the Drury Hollow. That surprised me. I didn't think there'd be enough water. I've seen the Drury all dry. But apparently there's some water flowing sometime to run the mill. Okay, now. Oh, this is a postscript. I wanted to do this at the very end, but I think I'm going to do it now. And because once I get that big map on, that map's not coming off and Chris has to hold it. Here's my postscript. My original thought was, last April, that the upper limit of logging roads, what I call the upper logging limit, where if you're climbing a mountain, the roads and the stumps stop, would be equal to the upper limit of sugar maple. In other words, if they're logging for sugar maple for piano bars and for other sugar maple wood products, they would stop naturally where the sugar maple stopped, and they wouldn't go above it. And sugar maple does have an upper limit on these mountains. It averages somewhere around, as I said before, 26, 27, 2,800 feet, maybe 3,000 feet in a few places. And you might ask, well, why? Well, the reason is water. Sugar maple needs a lot of water. It won't grow in a swamp where the water is stagnant, but it will grow in moist soils where the water is at least flowing. And you don't have much water holding capacity way up high on these ridges over 3,000 feet. Number one, the soils are very shallow to bedrock. They don't hold much water, and they're extremely rocky. They're stony. So that if you go through a place that is, say, dominated by yellow birch are often growing on a stone pile. So sugar maple can't take it up there. There's just not enough water. But what happens when you get above this sugar maple limit, you can have other species in there, and I have a listing of them here. Beech, yellow birch, red maple, black cherry, which I call ridge hardwoods. That is, hardwoods without sugar maple is what I call ridge hardwoods. Beech, red maple, yellow birch, mountain ash, black cherry. You might have others mixed in, like red cherry. And in certain places you have balsam fir. In the eastern Catskills, red spruce and balsam fir. And in the far western Catskills, neither spruce nor fir. I call these ridge hardwoods, and they'll get all the way up. They'll get all the way up to 3,800 feet, and there's no sugar maple up there. But some of these trees, if they were large enough and merchantable enough, could be harvestable. So some of the logging roads and stumps will go above the sugar maple limit if the lumber company was looking for these other types of trees, which will grow above sugar maple. So that was one of the problems I realized later, that some of these roads are going to go higher than the sugar maple limit because they weren't after sugar maple. Maybe they wanted black cherry or yellow birch or beech. Not much oak when you get up there. Oak is very limited in distribution. If I ever got into a discussion on the distribution of northern red oak, that would take a 4-credit college course. It has to do mostly with Native Americans, forest fires and abandonment of farm fields. The uppermost population of northern red oak that I've seen in the Dry Brook Valley is right around the Shandaken Brook confluence with the Dry Brook. And I haven't seen it, that's just the local population. Still can't figure out why it's there. There's quite a bit near Haynes Hollow, and farther north when you get toward the Bushkill and the Delaware, red oak gets more abundant. Now, Chris, can we try here?
Sure.
Let's see what happens. Just go upside down.
Is that right? What corner do you want to see first?
You might want to flip it, invert it. That's it. Okay. This map is far too big for the projector. Now, how much time do I have? I go 12:30 to 1:15, is it? Brian, where's Brian? You come on at 1:30?
You got half hour. Go as long as you want.
Oh, well, good. Okay, that means I can really go through this map slowly. We were on the legend. Great. Now, what I did is this map is at a scale of 1 to 12,000. Not on the screen, but on the plastic. It's a scale of 1 to 12,000. If you're familiar with scales of maps in the Catskills and elsewhere, does 1 to 24,000 ring a bell to you? It should, because the U.S. Geological Survey's 7.5-minute quadrangles are at a scale of 1 to 24,000. Well, that means 1 foot on the map is 24,000 feet on the ground. And that was a traditional scale. So I figured that's not big enough to show the detail I wanted to show. I had to enlarge it. So I enlarged the 1 to 24,000 scale maps, U.S. Geological Survey base maps, to a scale of 1 to 12,000. And at that scale, an inch, well, let's see, a mile is about 5 inches, about like this for a mile. At 1 to 24,000 a mile is like this, but when you enlarge it to 1 to 12,000, it's about like that. So the mile is pretty big, so you can get a lot of detail in. So that was used as a base map for me to trace. And of course, I could trace with tracing paper that's only 8.5 by 11 in order to cover the immense Dry Brook area at a scale of 1 to 12,000. I needed 6 maps to do it. So here's my legend. I have streams, which are, well, the color doesn't show up, but this is in color. If anybody wants to come up later and look at the color, we can back this up on the cardboard and you can study it and you can see the color. But I have streams, I have ponds and bogs, high elevation sugar maple groves, we're going to talk about that, and other vegetational features, roads and log roads, sawmills and other historic buildings like camps, foot trails, both extant and abandoned, summits, which are triangular, elevations in feet, hundreds of elevations. I'll explain why and where they came from. Property boundaries, pretty much the furlough lands bordering on state land, stumps, and then entry points. I have to explain what an entry point is, and a north arrow and the scale. Now on the screen, as I said, this is on 1 to 12,000, it's a lot larger, but on this, it's 1 to 12,000. I should explain what an entry point is. I had to create that point when I started mapping the Catskills as a graduate student. When you're down in the valleys and you're starting up a mountain and you're going through forests which have been actively used by people, so they've been logged over, they might have been burned over, they could have been farmed over with the farms being abandoned, they were barked over by the tanning industry, that people who wanted hemlock bark, they were quarried over, so you have all kinds of human activity concentrating in the lower elevations. And when you get up high, the average of the elevation in the Catskills is running about 2,800 to 2,900 feet. And above that point, the human activity stops or slows down, and then above that, when you're above 3,000 feet, most of the forest has been left intact. No one really wanted it, or couldn't get to it, or both. Didn't want it and couldn't get to it, because the trees are short, they're scrubby, they're gnarled, they're twisted, they're deformed, they're slow growing, they're defective, they're not much of use to anybody, so they're left alone up there on the ridges. Also, when you get up high, you've got ledges in the way, you have boulder talus. It's hard to get a skid or a team of horses in a wagon up there. So A lot of the ridges above about 3,000 feet are in the original growth, which we call first growth forest. You want to call it primeval forest, you want to call it virgin forest. It's forest that has been left alone for industrial uses. Of course, people are up there. You have hikers, you have people hunting, you have people camping, and people doing scientific studies, but no real industry up there. So when you're going up a mountain and you go from second growth forest, which has been, or third growth, which has been humanly used for all kinds of purposes, when you transfer into the original growth forest, I call that an entry point, because you're entering first growth. And those on this map are shown as a dot with a circle around it and a purple line, where you won't be able to see the purple. And you ask, how many entry points do I have now for the whole Catskills? Well, how many are there for the Dry Brook Valley? Just a few dozen. Some areas have been mapped more carefully and thoroughly than others. But for the whole Catskills, I've got between 500 and 600 entry points. And there's still places where people are saying to me, they're too far apart. We need to get in there and get more entry points because the map is not accurate enough. By the way, are you people familiar with what's going to happen in Oliveria, October 26th to 28th? Catskill Environmental Research and Monitoring Conference. And we're going to have, on Friday the 28th, Steve Parisio and a few of us will be, and myself will be leading an old growth forest hike. And there'll be posters up showing the distribution of original growth forests in the Catskills at that conference. We're getting ready for that. And my colleagues are complaining to me that there are places too far apart, too large gaps between my entry points. You better get in there and map it, because there might be a 2-mile stretch where I don't know where the first growth begins, and you gotta guess at it. Okay, now let's move up the valley. I don't have too much. Can we get through? Oh, it bends down. Okay, okay.
What do you want to show?
Well, let's see. We can work our way up the valley. Let me go back down. I want to go a little bit west. Oh, what's this thing? Hey, it's showing. You know what that is? It's a piece of Scotch tape. Because I taped 6 plastic sheets together to make one big map, and I didn't realize that the plastic, supposedly transparent tape is not transparent on that overhead projector. So that's what that blotch is. Okay, let's go a little bit. Let's.
It would need to bend down.
We want to start at Singer Post Office.
Okay.
Let's see which way. Okay. We can start there and go up the upper end. I've got covered bridges on this map. The elevations are in feet. Here's Seegers, or I've been told it's not Seeger, it's Sigurd, and I have a lot of other corrections on pronunciation. Seegers Mill, which is right where the Turner Hollows came, or just with it. Wait a minute. Look, somebody got the mill in the wrong place. Oh gosh, I got a mistake. Whoops, what's happened?
You were off mic.
Oh, okay. I think I have to make a correction, but all right, I don't want to go into details now. I think I might have Seeger's Mill in the wrong place. I have to, no, I think I have it in the right place. That's where the old Tapan Road crossed Dry Brook, was the mill was there. Okay, no, I think I have it in the right place. These are some of the side roads that run off the Dry Brook Road, which is red. The blue is the streams. Here's Gormley's lower mill. Gormley's upper mill was much farther upstream. And the trailhead, if you know what's all that noise? Someone had too much lunch? What's going on? Here's the trailhead for a number of mountains. The Seeger trailhead. What is that?
Motorcycle.
Oh my.
So that's the end of the road, right?
Okay. At Paul Smith College, we seldom had background noise like that when someone's trying to lecture. And let's move up. I want to show you what happens when you go upstream.
Upstream.
Yeah, let's go. So we got to go south. That way. Okay. These red lines are logging roads, which I've mapped. And you might say, if you know the area well, you'll say, there are errors. Some of those junctions aren't right. And then you might say, well, you've got some roads missing. Sure, because I haven't had the time to go everywhere. I've been somewhere, but not everywhere. And hiking these old logging roads, trying to figure out where they go and how they connect, and the question marks and corrections. There are even old farms back up in there in places, and places where I recorded where there were stumps. So the red lines are logging roads, and I have other features in here. Now, let's go a little bit farther upstream. There's more up in here. Okay, here we go. The logging roads mostly follow the major stream valleys, and then they climb up onto the ridges, and they branch, and they can rebranch and connect, so you get a whole network. These red lines are logging roads. Here's Gormley's Upper Mill, which is way up there. What was the elevation on that? I gotta read this. What's the elevation? Oh, we're up about 2,500 feet for the highest mill. It's pretty high up in the valley. And this line, this dark line that weaves around, notice how it goes above and around the ends of the log roads and the stumps. That's the line that connects my first growth entry points. So this would be an entry point. And that one, and that one, and that one, and that one, and that one. They're all numbered. EP means entry point. That is, as you're going up the slope, the logging road ends, the stumps end, and you're into original growth forest. And this line connects these entry points. If the entry points are too far apart, because I haven't been there, look at the distance between these two. That's got to be over a mile, because why isn't an entry point there? I didn't get a chance to get there and to map it. So you'll have guesses, and maybe the line doesn't run from here to there. Maybe the line runs this way, or maybe it runs that way. I just drew it in as guesswork on contour this way. So there's a lot of detail that is not known, but this is the best I could do for what I have. So let's go up farther and see what's going on up on the slopes. Then we'll go west and we can go east. Okay, this is what I want to concentrate on now. Let's see how we're doing on the time. Good. It's only 1 o'clock. We're way up on the ridges. We're way up on the ridges. Some of the Big Indian Mountain is east. Here's Double Top. Graham Mountain is off to the west here. This is the boundary line between state land on the south and Furlough, or the Gould family land on the north. And I have some various features here. I have a number of bogs that I've studied along that line, but there are a lot of dots that show up as green, all these dots, and I want to talk about them. And there are more green dots. Here's a line of green dots connecting the ridge between North Double Top and Graham. Here's the saddle between North Double Top and Graham. I would add that you need to have some intimate knowledge of the topography up in here in order to really absorb some of this detail. If you've never been there, or you've been there and never really noticed what's going on in the forest, it's just a big blur, a mass of useless information. It's when you try to put it together. So all these green dots are way up on the ridge lines, and what they are is sugar maple groves. Whoops. High elevation sugar maple groves. And I just did an article for this issue, the fall issue of CFA News, which should be out in a few days. It's not out yet. And it's about the 2 reasons why there are high elevation sugar maple groves. By high elevation, let me get some elevations out to you. I got, what's that, 3,400, 3,600, 3,700 feet. Sugar maple all the way up as high as 35, 36, 3,700 feet on Big Indian Mountain, Double Top Mountain, Graham Mountain, Balsam Lake Mountain, all through this area and in other places in the Catskills. Some people say, well, the reason why sugar maple stops at a certain elevation for the most part is because of it can't take the cold, it can't take the winters and the short growing season. That's not really true. It can take a short winter, a long winter and a short growing season and cold temperatures. It's just, it's a water problem. It's not a temperature problem. If the conditions in the soil and the water are okay for sugar maple at 3,700 feet, it'll grow up there. And you might say, well, wouldn't it be stunted? Yeah. Slow growing? Sure. Deformed? Yeah. But it's there and it survives. And it can live to old age up there. So what's with these groves? Well, until 2 years ago, I always assume that the groves marked springs and seeps, wet places, because most of these high elevation ridges are so dry that sugar maple cannot survive up there. But if you have, at the base of a bench, do I have any other? I have to look to see if I have another map. At the base of one of these benches, if you know what a Catskills summit looks like, or when you're climbing a peak, it's a staircase. You're going up gradually, you got a ledge, gradually and a ledge, gradually and a ledge. And at the base of some of these ledges, the water's flowing out from inside the mountain and flowing out and creating a rather wet spot, and the soil is pretty deep and sugar maple can grow. So you have these high elevation groves, and above them is ridge hardwoods, other species, and below them, same thing. That's why I call them sandwiches, sugar maple sandwiches, because they're sandwiched between other species growing on sites that are too dry below and above. And 2 years ago, I don't want to go into detail what happened on Blackhead Mountain, and it happened again on Fly Mountain to me this Memorial Day, that there's another cause, a second cause for high elevation sugar maple groves, and that's what I wrote about in the article that's coming on sugar shale sandwiches. Sugar shale sandwiches? Yeah. There are places in the Catskills, high elevations, where instead of having the typical sandstone or conglomerate bedrock, you've got shale, and usually red shale. It doesn't have to be red, but shale. And on those shale slopes, if they're holding enough water, you might have sugar maple growth. And it's not even a seep or a spring, and it may not even be flat. It may be gently sloping, but these are remarkable places. I found only 2. I'm looking for more, where sugar maple is up there at 35, 36, 3,700 feet because it's growing on a bedrock shale. Above that is glacial till soil, which is derived from that red shale. And then on top of that, you have the sugar maple, and there are very few boulders and rocks grow on that shale. Above that and below that, you got sandstone with ledges and birches and fir and spruce and scrubby shrubs. But where the sugar maple is growing, you would think you were down to 2,500 feet, but it's just a grove. And if you keep climbing up the mountain, you'll go out of it. So you're climbing up the mountain, you're in sugar maple lower elevation, almost continuous stance. You hit the first set of ledges and boulders and talus, and you're back and you're into this scrubby birch, spruce, fir forest with shrubs, and then you're back into the sugar maple groves, and then up, and then out of it again. By the way, you might ask, where's the highest elevation sugar maple grove? It's on Hunter Mountain. How high is it? It's about 3,800 feet. So we have sugar maple at 38. We even have a few places where it's 37. Now, is there another? Did I leave one out? Let's see. Let's poke around, see what we have, and then I have to stop soon. Got a little time. Can we move? We'll move forward.
It needs to tuck under there.
Oh, pull it up, bend it up.
Okay.
Bend it up.
Okay.
Whoops. Let's go west, see what we have west, because I'm going over to Graham Mountain here, and the telephone line up Graham Mountain, and I have other features on this map that are slightly related to the topic. Here's a road that goes up Graham Mountain that served the educational television tower, relay tower on the summit back in the 60s, and the logging went up to about the 3,500 foot level. Above that, the forest's first growth. And there is sugar maple higher up. There's a sugar maple seep, a big terrace at about 3,600 feet. Let's see, anything else of interest? We're going over here west. Wait a minute, let me put this down. I knew this would be awkward moving a giant map around on a small projector. We're going over to Balsam Lake Mountain. We're going west. You got the Beaver Kill terrain down here. You want to go east? Which way do you want to go? You want to go north? Do you want to see where Furlough Lake is? We have that. What do you want to see? Where do you want to go? Nowhere? What?
The lake.
What?
The lake.
Furlough Lake? Okay. That's way north. And wait a minute, what's stuck? Wait a minute, no, we gotta go west. Well, getting close. Just a minute. What's the matter with it?
Here's Furlough Lake.
Oh, okay. Okay. Now, this is Furlough Lake, which is the Gould Estate. And you notice this is blank. Why? Well, I've never been there to map it. Well, why? Well, Kingdon Gould and I had an agreement. It was okay for me to go map the forest around, but I didn't want to get too close to the houses and the cabins. I didn't want to just be in the way. So this area, as far as I know, this is unexplored. It hasn't been mapped, unless you've mapped it and I don't know about it. So this is the area, and we can go east. Let's see which way we want to go. East, this way. And we can go north. There's a whole bunch of covered bridges. We're getting now toward Haynes Hollow. Betty and Lori Baker showed me the Cook Mill. I couldn't believe there was a mill there would be enough water power in Haynes Hollow to run a mill, but there's even some mills that were even on smaller streams than the Haynes Hollow. So, let me just check, make sure I haven't left anything out, because I'll have to wrap up. Okay, maybe we can move that off to
Yeah.
Thank you, thank you.
Of course.
There was a question here for you. Oh, well, now we got to put the map back up just for a second. Sorry. I did want to tease you with a geographic question.
Where do you want to show?
Southeast corner.
Okay.
Okay. No. Well, yeah. All right. Here. This is a bit awkward. Thanks to Chris, it's helping a lot. Here, this black line is the property line between the state land and Furlough. Here it is here, and here it is here, and here it is here. Let's go south a little bit. A little bit more south. Well, okay. Well, I want to go west. Hold it. Okay, here we go. Here the blaze is the line of property is pretty much following a divide between the Neversink and the Delaware and the Dry Brook. But notice here's a line going here from southeast to northwest, and you notice some of the other lines, the boundary lines, were running from southeast to northwest and running from southwest to northeast. Here's a question for you. Why aren't they running due east-west or due north-south or even due magnetic north-south? Why are they running at this crazy angle? That's a good teaser for you. Why? I bet some of you know. Why? Why are those property lines running at these weird angles? And it's not just here. It's throughout most of the Catskills. You've got this north 37 degree east, not northeast or north, but 37 degrees in many places. It varies a bit.
Tell us.
What?
Tell us why.
I can't get you.
Tell us why. I don't know.
Tell you what. Nobody knows? Hardenberg patent. The Hardenberg patent lot lines, the great lot lines. Most of, maybe all, but I have to look, of Dry Brook is in Great Lot 7. We're in Great Lot 7 right now, the Hardenberg patent. What is that, 1708? I think it's 1708. The Hardenberg patent, the Catskills were mapped and then divided up into great lots, the great lots into tracts, the tracts and patent and the tracts into lots. We're in Great Lot 7. Great Lot 8 is north of us. As you go south toward Sullivan County, you go through, strangely, 9 and 10, and then into 6, and then into 5, and into 4. And up in Greene County, it's what, 21 through 26? And the high numbers are out between the branches of the Delaware. So these are lot lines of the Hardenberg patent in which, what?
That's next door.
Well, why is, oh well, I'm almost done anyway. But it's Hardenberg patent lot lines, yes.
Why did they orient to 37 degrees?
I think in this part of the Catskills it's 37. In other places it's less. It varies. I do know that one of the reasons had to do with drawing, if you look at a map of the Hardenberg patent, between the east and west branches of the Delaware, the lines, almost connect at right angles to the major directions of the stream. But it's not always that way. It's a variable, but that's about the average. It usually runs about 37, 40, maybe even 45 degrees. But and all the lots, if you are working with forest history, and I have colleagues almost constantly asking me, when was this forest acquired by the state into the forest preserve? Well, the first thing I got to do is look up to see what Hardenberg patent great lot it's on, what lot it's on, and then I have to go through all my reference materials in my home library to find out when it was acquired, because you have to know the lot numbers and the great lot numbers, otherwise you're lost in the Catskills. So that's why you have these odd angles like this, going from southeast to northwest, and it's not going due east-west. It's the Hardenberg patent.
I have a question, Mike.
Yeah, oh, we got 2 minutes.
Is there old growth on Gould land, or is all the old growth? Oh, thank you. Is all the old growth on state land?
I think it's on both. You've got some on Gould land. Oh, you have your microphone. Yeah, there's some of it.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, there's some of it on private land, and not just only on the Goulds, in other parts of the Catskills. And usually it's land that's high up, that's inaccessible, that's full of steep ledges and cliffs and boulders and talus. And the forest was either inaccessible or it was just too stunted and deformed to be merchantable, or a combination of both. Usually they run together. So yeah, there is. Because look here. Here's the boundary line. This is all furlough land. Look where the first growth line is. So there's quite a bit of first growth on furlough land. And there are other places in the Catskills. Winnesota Club has some patches of first growth. And up in Greene County there are places. It really depends more on accessibility and merchantability and topography than it does on property ownership. Okay.
Do you want to show that next slide?
I think I'm done.
We got a question.
Pretty much.
Every question.
Yeah. Wait. Question?
How do you know where those sawmills were? How do you know?
How do I know where the sawmills were? Okay. Thanks to the Baker family, Larry and Betty and Laurie have, since I was a graduate student, supplied me with detailed maps. I have some of them with me on the locations of these mills. Also, there are other sources that will confirm the Baker's mapping. The atlases, if you're familiar with the Beers Atlas of Ulster County, 1875, and the Beers Atlas of Delaware County, 1867. The old 19th century atlases will locate some of them. Also, there are histories that were written by people in the 19th century. There was Sylvester's History of Ulster County. There's what's the Delaware County? Munsell, Delaware County History. These history books will sometimes give you specific information on locations. They're not always, but at least they can give you a general idea where they were, because the mill could have been in the hamlet of such and such, or at the confluence of these two streams, and you can pin that down exactly. So there are other sources, but everything seems to fit together. But my major source has been through the Larry, Betty, and Laurie Baker over the years. I've got a whole file here on Dry Brook Valley, which is not the best organized.
Okay. Hi, just quick 2 questions. When did the last mill in the valley cease operation? And are there still physical remains of many of these mills that you can see?
There is physical. There are physical remains. That's what our tour with Betty Baker and Laurie Baker last April was about. We were looking for remains, not only of mills, but of other historic buildings, churches, schools, post offices, stores. The last I can see is about circa 1950, the Baker Mill up in Ryder Hollow. Some of them might have run into the 30s and 40s, 1930s and 40s. About 1950, approximately. Quite a few of them were lost in 1901 by the flood. If you're familiar with the Millbrook Valley in the hamlet of Grant's Mills went out in the flood of 1901, and a whole bunch of them went out that were running in the Dry Brook Valley in 1901. I still have to get that timeline going that will show all the mills and when they ran and so forth.
I don't know if you know the answer to this, but why is Dry Brook called Dry Brook?
From what I have heard, take it from what it's worth. It has nothing to do with water. From what I heard, how do you say three bridges in Dutch? How do you say three bridges in Dutch?
Dry.
Drie bruggen.
Is it close to Dry Brook?
Drie bruggen.
Is it close to Dry Brook? It might be a corruption of three bridges. I can't be sure. From what I heard, it's a corruption of the Dutch. And if you like corruptions, I want to do an article for the Catskill 3500 Club on a number of other corruptions, like Giggle Hollow and Penguin Rocks. But I'm not 100% sure on that.
You mentioned another corruption, Mike. I was curious. You said Seeger was initially?
Yeah. The Bakers pronounce it Seeger. So I try to pronounce it the way the locals do. And I've heard, a friend just reminded me that Oliveria is pronounced Oliverie. So I have to pronounce it both ways. And when we're at the CERM conference there in October, I better pronounce it both ways.
So, sorry, but if it was Dry Brook, and what are the three brooks?
No, three bridges.
Three bridges, so where's the
We got to figure out which the three bridges are.
Probably washed out.
You'd have to look at a topo map. Or I could show you here probably on this map. I'd have to show you. I think there are more than three. I think the main Dry Brook Road goes over four. I have to think. There's just so much geography you can have in your head, especially when you're doing the whole Catskills. All the mills, all the tanneries, all the logging roads, all the first growth for the whole region. There's just so much you can absorb. You need to use the maps. You gotta go.
Oh, that's okay. Keep going.
Well, we need time to set up and I need time to take down.
We're going to do a changeover time.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, we'll have to do a changeover. But Mike, you're going to be around for a while, right? If somebody wants to corner you in.
Yeah, I want to hear Brian.
Well, you want to hear Brian?
Yeah. Also, I have to take down this massive.
Sure. Okay, we'll take a.
Thank you.
We'll get back together at 1:30. Thank you so much, Mike. Next speaker is Brian Ellis. I'm certainly looking forward to hear him speak. I think it's a vital topic. We just got a bit of the history of the Catskills. This is going to give us maybe a little bit of a taste of what we need to be considering on how we manage the lands as we move forward. And with that, Brian, we'll let you go with it. Thank you.
Appreciate it, Frank. My name is Brian Ellis. I am the section leader for Division of Lands and Forests, our climate forestry and carbon section. It's a new section that was created to start looking at our forests through the lens of climate change, what impacts that's having on our forests, as well as looking at measuring forest carbon, which is a non-traditional way to measure forests, but a way that we are seeing change in our forests and that we can evaluate the type of management that we're doing on the lands. So today, I'm going to just try to stay too out of the weeds a little bit, but I'm going to give a little background on the science of forest carbon so that we're all kind of looking at things the same way, understanding kind of the topics that we're talking about. I'm going to talk about forest carbon markets, which is a new emerging thing. They've been around for a little while, but just now kind of getting brought down to scale for forest landowners so that they're not, 2,000, 3,000 acre properties, that 40-acre property is now starting to be able to be enrolled in programs and getting a payout for landowners. So it kind of helps landowners meet different objectives if they're not interested in timber harvesting or they're looking for a different type of management. It could give them some other options. I'm going to talk a little bit about the CLCPA, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act in New York. It's been an effort that's been ongoing. We've been analyzing the forest and agriculture sector, looking at how we can improve our forests statewide. This is an opportunity for us in New York to really start to mobilize and get some help out there for forest landowners and improve forests throughout the state. So I'm going to start by just talking a little bit about the global carbon cycle. And when you talk about forest carbon, we have to kind of put it in the context of the Earth as whole. And we have, as most people know, this is not something new, we have our atmosphere, our air that we breathe, it's everywhere, and then how that interacts with the other carbon pools on the Earth. So we have our geologic carbon, which is our fossil fuels, our rocks. We have our oceanic carbon pool, which is actually the largest carbon pool on the Earth. We have algae and different plants that are in the ocean that sequester carbon and hold a large amount of carbon. We also have our peculiarity, which is our soil layer, which holds a lot of carbon, does a little bit of sequestering, but it's mostly a store and a place that we store a lot of carbon. And then what I'm going to focus on today is our biogenic carbon pool, which is the living matter that is above ground on Earth. Trees and forests being the largest portion of that pool, and the place where it's most dynamic, where we have the ability to impact, how much carbon is stored, how much is sequestered. And I'll talk about this, in the context of New York State mostly. But it is important to understand that these things change over time. So I don't want to talk about too much about climate change, because I'm here to really talk about our forests and what impacts we're going to see in our forests and how carbon changes in our forests depending on different management. But why people care about carbon in general has been driven by a concern about climate change. And so trees take in carbon dioxide, and if we look at the map here or the graph here on the left, we see the top scale is our CO2 levels in the atmosphere, and the bottom is temperature on the Earth, and that's over the last 800,000 years. So you see there's a very dramatic change over time. It's constantly changing, but it does relay very closely to the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. At the table on the right and that graph, it shows the same thing that we were looking at on the left, except we blew up the last 150 years to see the change. It's really hard to see that on the left hand, but the right hand we see a drastic increase over the last 150 years of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. So people are looking at solutions, looking at how we can sequester more carbon to try to either bring that down or mitigate that change. And so trees are the solution to everything, right? So they take in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, they release oxygen, we all love it, we all need it to breathe. And half of the dry weight of trees is carbon. So when we're talking about carbon in our forests, we're talking about that carbon that is stored in trees. And just to try to get some of our terminology down here. We say carbon versus carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is the gas that's in the atmosphere. Carbon is what is stored in things that we like in trees as a solid, and so it's eventually released back into the atmosphere through things like respiration, decomposition, combustion. If we burn wood, things like that, that carbon is released. For a lot of climate papers, they will convert things to CO2 equivalents. So they'll kind of say, that carbon that's in the tree is equivalent to this much CO2 that's in the air. Try to talk in common terms. And when I talk about carbon, we talk about carbon storage, so how much carbon is held. We talk about sequestration, which is the rate of change of carbon over time. And so that's how much carbon is being taken in by that tree over a year or whatever time period you say. Carbon emissions, which is carbon being released. And then carbon flux is that change in carbon storage over time. So just like we have in a global sense, the biogenic carbon pool has a number of also other pools where carbon is stored within a forest. And as we try to dig down and understand the type of management that we're doing and how that's going to impact the carbon stores in our forests, we have to think about all the different carbon pools. And so within our forests, we have our above ground biomass layer, so those are the trees. You have a below ground biomass layer in your root systems. You have your soil layer, which holds quite a bit of carbon. Dead wood, so dead trees that are there, they're not sequestering, but they're holding carbon. and then your leaf litter. And so depending on the type of management that you do, you'll affect those carbon pools differently. And depending on landowners' goals and objectives, they'll want to do different things, and that will have a different impact on the type of carbon and how much carbon is being stored in their forests. It's a little hard to see here, but the figure on the left here shows the differences in carbon storage versus carbon sequestration between all of those pools. And it's hard to tell in this the difference between brown, which is your soil. Your soil holds, in this forest type at least, about 55% of the carbon in your forested system, while about 30% is in your above ground, and then the rest have a small amount. In terms of sequestration, so like what's doing the work, what's taking carbon out of the atmosphere, your above ground biomass layer is sequestering the largest amount, and while your soil is really only sequestering a very small fraction in bacteria and living organisms in that soil that is sequestering carbon, like 5 or 6%. So your above ground, when we think about how to increase sequestration or change those levers, above ground biomass and the trees on your forests are really where you can actually make a change. So I've tried to talk a little bit today about that we can make impacts, and that we have that there are changes over time in terms of sequestration rate of our forests. So how much carbon is being taken up versus how much is being emitted, and this is, a lot of different factors affect how a forest will interact over time. Things like moisture, how much rain we get over the growing season will affect how fast a forest sequesters carbon. Temperature, during the winter, trees aren't growing. We're having almost no sequestration during that period of time. Length of the growing season, so if we see, a longer growing season, earlier spring, later fall, we'll see, a longer time that those trees are able to sequester carbon over that period of time, as well as, really specific site-specific things. So when, on your forest, depending on how productive that site is, how much light is available for those trees, how nutritious that soil is for your trees, is going to really influence how fast that is sequestering and how much carbon is released. And then obviously things very specific like tree genetics, tree age, tree size, tree vigor, and how many trees are in the forest, how dense that forest is going to play a really significant role in how fast that forest is sequestering or releasing carbon into the atmosphere. And as that we look at this over time, we got to look at it over time and over a large scale. Within a stand, you can have a good variation of sequestration rate and carbon storage over time, and the figure on the left kind of shows one example of how that would look in a forest. And as you lose trees, they can have a big influence on a stand, but then when you kind of look at that over a landscape scale, that will level out, and you'll see that kind of trend line. And so as we look at our forests in New York, and our forests have been studied for a number of years by the Forest Inventory Analysis, we have pretty detailed carbon data on our forests going back to about 1990. We see that our carbon storage, and that's the top graph on the left, has been increasing since 1990. So our forests in New York are storing more carbon, and they have been since 1990, and steadily increasing. But our sequestration rate, which is the graph right below that, shows a decrease in sequestration over that time period. And you really have to kind of dig down into the numbers to understand why we're having that kind of a change in New York over time. And currently today, about 62% of New York State's land area is forested. And that graph that we have at the bottom here shows the historic land trends in New York and the change in forest area over time. So about the late 1800s, early 1900s, New York was about 20% forested, and has been rebounding ever since. Due to agricultural land clearing was the majority of that. And so, we've gained pretty much 40% of our land mass in trees over that time period. And so if you think about that on a grander scale, our trees in New York are reaching about 100 years old, maybe a little bit younger. For a northern hardwood forest, as we have that type of succession in our forests, that's when we really start to see a decrease in sequestration rates within our forests as they age. And so that's playing a large part of it. But what this graph is really not showing is that we have forest gain, forest loss over that time period, and over the last 10 years, we're starting to now lose forest area in New York. So more area is being converted to development and agriculture than we're gaining from old fields successing into forests. And so we're starting to actually see a loss of, in New York, about 30,000 acres a year of forest. And so that's impacting our sequestration rate, and we'll be seeing a loss of storage over time from things like that. Other things that have really influenced it are the impact of invasive species, which we'll talk a little bit about later. Things like emerald ash borer, hemlock woolly adelgid have decreased the productivity of our forest statewide, and we're really starting to see the impact of that when we look at the forest through the context of carbon. So, as I went through this a little bit, and I'm sorry for all like the scientific jargon here, but we have the graphs here kind of show the change over time in the carbon pools within our forests. And so, as our forests age and the above ground biomass ages, we have an increase in carbon stored over time. And so that carbon would be lower at a young forest than the soil and the leaf litter and the dead wood. But then over time, as that forest ages, more carbon is being stored in that forest. If we look at the flux or the sequestration rate over time, we see that we really maximize sequestration, which is the graph here on the right. Between ages, 15 to 20 years of age in a forest, about 50 is where we have the peak sequestration. That's our fastest growing forests. And it slowly increases. Trees never stop growing. But as the density of that forest decreases, as bigger trees take over, competition happens. Those big trees still sequester a lot of carbon, but they sequester less carbon on a forest and acre basis than we see on an individual tree basis. And so, just to kind of illustrate to everyone here that different forest types interact differently here, and different forest types will sequester carbon and store carbon at different rates. So all the lines on these graphs show different types of forests that we have in New York and the different change over time in terms of sequestration and storage that we see in those forest types. And so depending on the type of forest that you have on your property, you'll have a different potential at that forest to sequester carbon and store carbon over the long term. If you're looking to maximize things like sequestration or storage on your property for whatever goal that you want, be it joining a carbon market, the rate that you're going to get paid by that market will be affected by the type of forest that you have and the potential of that forest on your property to sequester or store carbon over the long term. So, one thing I did want to just highlight here again is just like the difference in single tree sequestration and growth versus that on a forested scale. And so, if you have a 10-inch diameter tree, it's going to grow at a much slower rate just because of leaf area and the amount of wood that it's going to put on each year than a large tree. And it's almost exponential in the way that happens. And the graphs here show, as a tree diameter increases, how much carbon is going to be stored and sequestered per year in that tree. And so, big trees have a really big influence in your forest in terms of how much carbon is being stored. But as we saw in the previous graphs, it's really important to have a balance between big trees and little trees in your forest, because those younger, more vigorous trees are growing faster and sequestering more carbon at a land area basis than you would from one single tree. So, this graph is a little bit difficult to see up here, but the carbon balance on your forests could take a number of different trajectories based on the type of management that you have. If you're looking to just leave your stand to grow over the long term, you'll have kind of the scheme that we're seeing on top, where the forest grows to about its maximum potential. You'll have, trees die, trees grow in, and you kind of create a balance over time. Where if you're harvesting your property, you could grow to a point, in forestry, we would grow it till, there's that we're getting like our maximum growth to our productive woods product. Do a thinning, get more growth after that, and you can kind of keep it at that fast growing state. And so, depending on how you want to manage your forests would affect the carbon balance on that forest. So there's a lot of words here. I was going to go over a little bit, just talking about like the different things that we can do on our properties to change how much carbon is on in our property and what kind of impacts those things are going to have. So, I would say the biggest thing and the biggest impact in the literature is keeping your forest as forest. So if you're not removing the forest from there, you're going to have that forest is going to remain productive, and it's going to sequester way more carbon than any other system that you could have on that area. Establishing reserves is something that a lot of folks do to increase storage on a property. Having areas where you're not going to cut timber, where you're going to leave that area to grow long term, would be another way to maximize carbon storage in that area. Extending rotations is also really impactful. A lot of carbon markets will have you extend the rotation or push out the rotation that you're harvesting. So you're maybe not harvesting at a 15-year interval, you're harvesting at a 20. And what that's going to do is you're going to increase storage during that period of time. The trees will theoretically be larger when you do that harvest because you've extended the amount of time they've grown, thus having higher quality wood products coming out of it that would then store carbon in the long term. So you're creating, high quality furniture or some other wood product that's happening. And New York is known for things like sugar maple and things like that, and having really high grade sugar maple is important for like long-term storage. If you're looking to increase the health of your stand, things like thinning or other harvests could help you change the age dynamics that you have in your forest. Either increasing sequestration, improving vigor of specific trees, helping those trees resist forest pests and prevent the loss of productivity in those forests. And as I kind of have highlighted the impact of large trees, if you do a harvest, leaving some selective large trees on that property could have a big influence both on the regeneration of the property afterwards, but also the carbon stored, as well as wildlife benefits that those big trees provide. Obviously, like well-stocked stands, so stands that are full of trees and aren't understocked, are really important so that you're maximizing the sequestration and like the tree growth on that forested area. And then, I think one of the things that's really important here is I talk about keeping forests as forests, and New York forests are continually impacted by invasive species, are things like increasing the resilience of that forest and its ability to adapt to future stressors, be it changes in the seasonality and temperatures, be it high wind pressure or invasives. Having a diversity of species that are of high vigor on the property will really help it remain productive over the long term. So, everyone kind of asks, like, well then, when you think about all those different strategies, which are very close to traditional management strategies that we have as foresters out there, and that your forester would recommend to you, how much do those cost? And, there's not a lot of data out here on this. This data was pulled from a study that was done up in Maine, so it doesn't totally relate to New York forests, but Maine has quite a few forests that are very similar. They've got sugar maple forests, hardwood forests. They also have a lot of spruce fir, which is a very different dynamic than we have in New York in terms of working forests. We've got spruce fir on the top of mountains, but those aren't really forests that landowners really own very much or are being worked in any real way. And so, we see the dots here. We're looking at how much that action costs versus how much carbon could potentially be sequestered, and avoiding forest loss is one of the largest impacts. We see passive management up there as one of the cheaper and more impactful actions. But we also see things like increasing stocking and understock stands, doing underplanting, doing patch cuts to encourage regeneration. Forests that are impacted by things like thermal ash borer and don't have productive trees, it's really important to try to increase the stocking in those stands. I would be glad to dig into this more with someone if they're really interested, but it's as we kind of think about New York forests as a whole, and we think about incentive programs and how we can get money to landowners to improve sequestration or storage on forests. We want to look at how much those things cost, to where we can really get the biggest bang for our buck. So forest vulnerability is a big thing in New York. We're seeing, and I could probably do an entire talk talking about the different changes in our climatic trends and what that means for the trees on everyone's property. I think the things that I would highlight here is the map on the right is looking at forests in New York that are under stress for regeneration. So that is a study that was done by the Nature Conservancy showing where we're lacking proper regeneration within our forests. So as you lose a tree, are you going to get trees replacing that? And the real conclusion here is that most everything on this map is red, orange, and yellow, and really there's only one spot where we have dark green, where we have secure regeneration. And we see that mostly because of deer pressure in New York. So we have overabundance of deer. Really the only dark green that we have is up in the Adirondacks, but there are portions of the Catskills that are better off than other parts of the state. We're seeing longer seasons in New York over the last 30 years. We've seen our spring come a little earlier, our fall leave a little later. We're seeing longer growing seasons. That can be good for some trees that can take advantage of that, but it will also stress other trees. So we can see loss of productivity in some of our trees due to that, especially because we've been seeing drier summer periods. So we've been seeing, our amount of precipitation in New York is actually projected, and we've been seeing an increase in precipitation over the last 30 years in New York. We've been seeing these long dry periods during the summer when trees should be productive, and that's really impacting our tree growth across the state. But we are getting heavy rains in the fall, heavy rains in the spring, and a lot of precipitation in the winter, which trees can't always take advantage of, and also leads to things like erosion and tree fall. We've been seeing increased storms, a lot more knockdown of trees because of that. And so those are the kind of things that we're seeing immediately. This is going to also lead to increased ranges of invasive species. So hemlock woolly adelgid moving into colder areas is something that we're seeing as we're not getting as deep winter colds to knock down that invasive species that we used to. We're seeing where years where we get 98% kill off in the Adirondacks, now we're seeing hemlock woolly adelgid move into the Adirondack regions that we thought once would be more resilient to that invasive species, which is going to really affect New York's forest as a whole. Hemlock was a big component in this area. We've lost a lot of it to hemlock woolly adelgid. The Adirondacks also has the biggest portion of eastern hemlock in the United States left, and it's the 4th most common tree in New York. But we've been seeing it slide down that scale. 15 years ago, it was the 3rd most common tree in New York. So we're seeing a loss of that keystone species within the state, and that's affecting dynamics and or carbon dynamics within our forests. As you're a landowner and you're thinking about a specific property that you own, you might want to think about what hemlock you have, how close it is, or what kind of health that hemlock has, and what you might have coming up after it. What's the deer pressure on that property? Are you going to be able to get regeneration, or are you going to have to fence or plant or do something like that to ensure tree succession after the loss of that species? And along with that, we're seeing we've been seeing a little bit of it, but we expect to see more of it. This increased stress means to less viable seed production in our forested ecosystems. And so, like hemlock, for example, is a tree species I know really well. because I used to be the statewide coordinator for hemlock, is if they get too big a drought period in the summer, they'll abort all their cones. And so, we're getting like less frequent cone crops from things like hemlocks and pine trees, which could then lead to, and oak trees as well. Oaks will drop their acorns halfway through the season if they're in extreme drought stress, and that leads to less frequent regeneration, less opportunity for those trees to regenerate over time. So, I kind of alluded to this, as we think about carbon in our forests and we start to understand that better, people hear about carbon markets and like what opportunity does that provide to landowners? And people will kind of use the term credit or offset interchangeably. Offset is mostly used in a mandatory carbon market system. We don't have any mandatory markets in New York, so New York isn't requiring that companies offset their emissions using carbon. And so really the only opportunity for landowners in New York is through voluntary markets. Because California, which has one of the only offset markets in the United States, doesn't want their mandatory credits being bought from New York forests. They'd rather have them in-state where they benefit California residents. And so, as you kind of delve into the world of carbon markets, I think this graph kind of helps explain sort of the stacked system that these markets are. So you have your carbon market where folks are selling carbon and buying carbon. Below that, you have your carbon registry. So your registry is a body that has accredited rules for how you would have what counts as a carbon credit, how you measure a carbon credit on the ground. And so that's creating the verifiability of that carbon so that people will understand when I'm buying this, how do I value it? What does that mean? So a registry will actually tell you, we need to see this much growth through trees, or this is how you'd actually measure that carbon on the ground. And then you have developers, and that's a little hard to see on this graphic. It's the light circle there. And a developer is a person or a company that will, get a methodology approved by a registry. Will they go out, reach out to landowners to try to, solicit interest, and then get landowners enrolled in a project to sell credits. And so your developers are the ones really doing the boots on the ground, and who most landowners are going to be working directly with a developer when trying to sell carbon credits. There we go. So there's a lot of different actions that can be done to create credits, and I'm going to go a little bit more into this here. But things like afforestation, reforestation, planting new trees, creating new forest area. There's clear, what we would call additionality, so more carbon stored versus the baseline in a reforestation or afforestation scenario. Avoided conversion, so if you're in an area where it's really that your forest could be converted to development, we see that a lot in the Hudson Valley, areas like that. You could enroll a credit and enroll in creating credits to say, well, I won't convert this land for 100 years. And that, you could get a certain amount of credits based on that. And then improve forest management, thinning, actions that you do in the forest to improve the health and sequestration of the forest. So I alluded to it earlier, large parcels have really been the only access to carbon markets in the past. Carbon markets have existed for 20, 30 years, but large parcels have really been the only group to be able to participate because economies of scale, the credit isn't worth that much, and the amount of time it takes to actually measure the change over time and do the inventory necessary costs hundreds of thousands of dollars. So you have to be enrolling 2,000 minimum, but the only projects we've been seeing in New York is more like 30,000, 40,000 acres. Those have just happened in the Adirondacks. And so what we're really seeing now is a change to smaller parcels. So as developers have had novel methods approved using new technology like remote sensing and forest inventory analysis data, they've been able to bring the economies of scale down on this. to get smaller landowners, 40 acres and up, access to these markets. And so we're just seeing, a new entry into this field for folks, and I expect that to change a lot in the future. It's sort of, I would say, like the Wild West, where we see companies join, we see them leave, and we've seen a lot of that in the last couple of years. And I expect until the market settles down, we're going to continue to see that. So here are like a few examples of carbon developers that we have in New York. We have like the Family Forest Carbon Program, which is run by Nature Conservancy and American Forest Foundation. It's only available in a couple of counties in New York, but I expect next year it's going to open to the rest of the state. They're a unique program that actually isn't, they are buying carbon credits from the landowner on what they project to occur and paying the landowner for it, but they're not actually selling those credits until they can verify that it actually happened. Where other forest developers are actually selling those credits ahead of when they're actually created. NCX is another really interesting one. It has a 1-year deferral, harvest deferral. They are it's really different than a lot of the others. The others have 100-year commitments, 40-year commitments, really long commitments for landowners. NCX is a 1-year commitment. But just to talk about the big changes, just last month, NCX had their methods disapproved by their carbon registry that they're selling for. So they are still selling carbon credits and enrolling landowners, but not through a registry. But I would say, they've got a lot of PhDs working there who know way more about what they're doing than I do. So I don't want to speak to the validity of their actual methods, because I don't totally understand what how they create their credits. But I would just say that that's, the viability of that program is a little up in the air right now. So as we talk about carbon credits, it's really important that as we're selling something, it's real. Carbon. While a tree exists, and if you're selling a commodity, it's really easy to understand. Carbon can be a little more difficult, and what the developer would buy and how they calculate their credits needs to be real and verifiable, and so that's really an important part, and that the role that the registries play in determining what is a real and verifiable credit. There needs to be additional carbon stored versus the baseline. So you'll see articles out there when you read about carbon credits on, well, they got paid for credits, but didn't change what they were going to do. So they enrolled their land next to streams that they weren't going to harvest anyways. And so, when those kind of things happen, it hurts the reliability of those credits and the value of those credits over time. And so we have some set standards, and we have true additionality and verifiability on those. We're going to see a lot of volatility in our prices over time. And then, these companies want to have permanent impact and show that carbon is permanently stored. And that's hard in a forested ecosystem that's dynamic and changing over time. And so you'll see a lot of these carbon programs have long commitments. And so as I get a lot of calls from landowners every day asking me, is this market right for me? Is this one right for me? I say, well, what do you want to do with your property in 40 years? Typically, a landowner is only going to have their property for 10 years in New York. That's about the maximum length that we're, not the maximum, but that's about the average length of land ownership in New York. And so the contracts that folks sign with carbon credit companies and developers will span multiple landowners, and so that could affect the management that's in the future, and going to encumber that land in the future on how it's managed, and it could affect the value of that property if you're going to sell it in the future. And so I try to tell people that they need to think about succession planning, what they want to do with their property over time.
I have a quick question, sorry now. How do they put something like natural disasters? Because it would change your carbon footprint if you had a fire, flood.
Yeah.
How do they account for that?
So every developer would have a different way to doing it. And it could mean that, there's amount of risk that's taken on for that. in thing, you know, if it's something like a timber harvest, say you cut off your timber even though you said you wouldn't, you know, the landowner would usually be, you know, would have to pay that credit back and buy those credits back from the developer, because they would be on the hold for that. If it's something that, you know, if there's a forest fire or invasive species that came through that wasn't something that could be predicted, you know, typically that landowner would not be held liable for that. But that's something that, you know, the developer typically would have on, you know, the risk that they're taking from developing those projects. That is another reason to work with the developer, is that you kind of have that buffer, where like maybe a larger landowner wouldn't be able to do that. So there's a lot of potential issues, as I've kind of pointed out a few of these during here, but you know, what programs that your property is already enrolled in. Are you in 480A, which requires harvesting at certain intervals? Does that interact with the carbon program that you're signing up for? It may not. But that's important to understand as you like go into these projects. I've talked a little bit about the length of the contracts. That's something that, you know, any landowner should think about before signing up for a program, especially when they're being told you don't have to do anything, keep your forest, we're going to give you, you know, someone told me the other day, you know, they got approached by a developer, they were going to give them $6,000 a year for credits developed on their land. And, you know, that's enticing and it could really help their property, but you know, what's the length of the contract? How's it going to influence what they want to do in the future is something to think about. You know, are you managing carbon at the expense of other goals? Is timber harvesting something you want to do? Are you collecting firewood off of your property? You know, what is put into that contract? How much are you available to take out? Are all things to think about. And then, you know, some people are really concerned about, you know, global climate change, the interaction of these markets. Are they verifiable? Is my forest making a difference? Some people, I get a lot of calls from people asking about that, and you know, enrolling in a market, you know, is an interesting way to get money into your property. But then, you know, some other company like American Airlines is then saying that they're carbon neutral based on the fact that they bought some credits from your property. So, you know, are you disincentivizing them reducing their emissions by doing that? Maybe, maybe not. But you know, it's something to think about as you enroll in these programs. So I'll just like run really quickly through the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Acts, sort of some things that I see coming in the future to New York landowners. This is an exercise that's been going on for the last number of years after the passing of this law. But you know, ag and forestry has a role in it. Basically, the law focuses on reduction of emissions in New York, and forests can play, you know, a minor role in terms of sequestration statewide in our goal to reach net zero by 2050. So, you know, we need to have, according to the law, 100% zero emissions from electric generation by 2040 and net neutral by 2050. So, with an 85% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So that last 15% can come from forest sequestration in New York. And so, you know, as we went through this, we looked at how we can get to that 15% and what tools we can put into landowners' hands, because over 75% of our forests in New York are owned by private landowners. So it's really like in the hands of landowners if we want to reach those goals. And most of the people that I talk to, they want to manage their land responsibly. Some people care about carbon, some don't. But, you know, the more money and tools that we can get into landowners' hands to keep their forests, to manage them properly, the better for New York forests, be it climate change or just forest health as a whole. So we look at like statewide sequestration. Here's another way to look at it. You know, in 1990, we were sequestering about 30 million metric tons a year in New York forests. That's decreased to about 26 million metric tons. And if we were to hit that 15% in New York, we'd need to sequester about 60 million metric tons. So I kind of say, you know, unless we're going to, you know, annex Vermont, that's probably not going to happen. So, you know, the first strategy here is keep forests as forests, so preventing development. We're losing 30,000 acres of forest a year in New York, so we got to try to prevent forest conversions, be it smart growth and other strategies in New York. So, land acquisition's obviously a big part of that. Fee conservation easements by the state, preventing conversions is one way to do it. But, I think the state has done a lot to purchase and protect development on large tracts of land across the state. As we've seen the state continue to be parcelized over time, it's more important now to get tools in the hands of municipalities, for municipalities to protect land that's important in that locality. And things like the community forest grant that New York State put out recently gave funding directly to municipalities to buy land for community forests. We just finished our first round of grants, and we're expecting that program to increase, but we're protecting, a couple hundred acres with that. Conservation easements for land trusts, another program where we're giving money to land trusts to preserve lands that are specific to regions that they want to protect with a forest focus, is another program. New York State tax law is another thing. Taxes on land is one of the biggest reasons that I hear that people sell and parcelize their land across the state. The tax law program in New York reduces tax burden on properties by 80% of the assessed value of that property. But we only see about 9% of forests across New York that are eligible actually enrolled in that program. So, how do we get this program to be, more modern? It was passed in 1974, fit landowners' goals today. We would need new programs. And so we've looked at programs like 480B and 480C that, don't have as many strict harvest restrictions, because fewer landowners want to do that in New York. There's fewer reasons to do it. People want to own their properties and manage them for wildlife, things like that. And so, creating programs that fit landowners' goals and objectives are important, as well as lowering acreage requirements. 480A has a 50-acre requirement, so minimum of 50 acres. The average acreage of forest landowner in New York is about 8 acres. So, in order to open that to a wider variety of people, we'd really need to decrease that eligible acreage. But that's something that would have to be done with a new law. And then regulating forest conversions. We protect things like wetlands that we see intrinsically valuable across the state, and protect it if we value forests similarly. One recommendation that we've had is protecting forests similar to that. So, do we need to replace forests in kind as we remove forests? Do we need to, incentivize developers to minimize development of forests, cluster development, use smart growth strategies? Is there a law that we could create that could do that? So improve forest management is the other strategy. So what are we going to do in our forests today? We have forest health issues across the state, prevention of forest health issues, things like EAB. We've seen, a loss of species across the state. What are we going to do to prevent the next EAB from coming across the state? Are we going to be able to manage our forests to do that? Are we protecting hemlock in areas that we think hemlock's important to protect? Increasing the ability to rapidly respond and mitigate those impacts is going to be important. And improve silviculture and restoration. Once those sites are impacted, how are we restoring those sites afterwards? Currently, there's not a lot of work being done, especially once that stand is no longer viable for a commercial harvest. A lot of tools are taken out of landowners' hands to manage. So doing outreach, training to foresters on carbon, giving tools and incentives to landowners to restore stands are all important tools that we would need. And again, I'm showing that table on the right is what's our next forest going to look like? Our current forest is really resilient, but northern hardwoods will live to 100, 150 years. What's going to come up next? What are we going to get growing back in after we get our overstory starts to die? That's going to be really important in the next future, and what my 3-year-old is going to grow up when they see their forest. And then afforestation and reforestation is a really big strategy in New York. So obviously, in order to get the gains that we need in terms of forest sequestration and storage, but also all the other benefits of forests in New York. We need to increase the amount of forest that we have. And so, a lot of people have looked at the potential of New York State to add forests in New York, and we see that there's nearly 4 million available acres across New York, and that's looking at not productive farmland and looking at open spaces, grasslands. That the reality is that might be down a little bit. Those were using aerial imagery. Maybe some of that's horse pasture that we don't want to convert. Maybe it's birdland habitat that we should protect. But compared to the other states in the Northeast, New York has more potential for afforestation and adding forests than any state in the Northeast. And so, areas like the Finger Lakes region really shows a lot of potential. Obviously, the Catskills have a lot of forests. We don't have a lot of spaces where there aren't forests. Not a lot of potential here, but in some areas of the state, that's a really important strategy. And what is New York State doing? And so, Regenerate New York was a program that we put out. We went through our second round this year. It gets the money in the hands of landowners to do restoration practices. Here are some of the strategies that we used in round one. We paid people to afforest and reforest land. Forest stand restoration. So if you had a degraded stand due to past harvest practices, invasive species impact, we paid people to do underplantings, to remove invasive species. And then competing vegetation control and deer exposure are also really important strategies in New York, because we have probably the highest deer pressure of any state in the Northeast as well, impacting our next growth of forests. And then the last thing I want to talk about here is, as we've seen the federal government really push into this space and have a lot of spending in the last 2 years. We've seen a lot of available money for climate practices. And recently, out of the Infrastructure Act, New York State applied for what we called climate smart farms and forests, to pay for these types of practices to be done on farms and forests across New York. And just last week, we received $60 million from the federal government to put money in the hands of landowners for these types of practices. So, we're still really figuring out how to work with ag and markets and ESF to verify and kind of account for that. But we're also working on how we're going to roll these programs out to landowners to help give landowners money to restore their forests and improve the health of their forests across New York. So that's a huge win for New York forests, and hopefully we're going to be able to mobilize that into action on the ground. And that's all I had today, but thank you. I appreciate everyone's time.
Brian, forest products. Forest products, as a person who has about 90 acres of timber, those markets are very important to me. They're all renewable resources, and I don't think we should forget that. How much what's the carbon expense for producing this chair compared to this one that's metal and plastic? I don't know what the exact numbers are, but I keep hearing that it's a lot less with wood products. So
yeah, but having to get more wood on our landscape, or through building materials, is really important. It's something we looked at in the CLCPA through different lenses, but looking at industrial section as well as buildings, how we can get more mass timber in our buildings. You can build sky rises out of wood products now with the engineered wood that we have. The replacement cost of using concrete in those is orders of magnitude different, where we're sequestering carbon opposed to creating carbon impacts on the landscape. And those actual buildings actually will resist natural disasters like earthquakes and things like that even more, because they're lighter and will actually bend with the impacts than a concrete structure would. So how do we get more of those on the landscape? How do we get our mills involved in the creation of those things? When someone wants to make a mass timber building today, they have to go to Wisconsin to a mill. How do we get those manufacturing done in New York so it can benefit New York landowners and get built on New York landscapes is an important factor in all of that.
do we have other questions?
This is very naive, but why would we want to be using the wood for manufacturing, because we would be replacing the wood used with wood that isn't as helpful for the climate.
So you know what I say is like you use wood for all sorts of different things. You know, it's in your home that you build. Some people heat their house with it. You know, it's all the paper products that we use. You know, if we're not getting it from New York forests that we know can be managed sustainably, and we have some of the most resilient forests in the world, then we're probably getting it from, you know, a tropical rainforest or another place where we're not able to verify the type of practices that are happening. You know, in New York forests, we could, you know, ensure that there's regeneration after it, that the trees coming up after that are sequestering carbon. That is all important, and it's not like wood products are going to go away. And creating something that's plastic to replace that, you know, is an extractive practice, and that's going to actually create more carbon than creating, you know, a wood chair. And so it's important to try to think about, you know, where those replacements are, and you know, what the next forest is going to be after we do those harvests, and ensuring that we have, you know, regeneration and sequestration moving forward.
Thank you, Brian.
Okay, thanks.
Appreciate you coming down. Appreciate our awareness here. Okay, for our last presentation, Lindsay Baxter from Cornell is going to speak about ticks and some of the diseases associated with them. I know it hits close to home for me. 2.5 years ago, I started having pains in my back, legs, and I just thought it was sciatica. And I did some physical therapy, which helped. And then I had my doctor's appointment. It was just about 2 years ago this time. And she took one look at me and says, "I think you have Lyme disease." And I didn't remember being bit by a tick or anything along that line. She said, "Well, you won't be the first." You know how she talks. And she was absolutely right. And certainly the doctors in this area are familiar with these Lyme disease in particular. So they're pretty quick on diagnosing things. And it's not that it can be terrible. And Lindsay will probably talk a little bit about some of the much worse symptoms that people have had. I know one young gal not far from here had to have a heart replacement because of the way the Lyme disease affected her. So with that, Lindsay, show's all yours. Thank you.
Yeah, like he said, my name is Lindsay. I have the great privilege of playing with bugs for a living, and I'm going to share some of that with you. I have a couple people with me here, Jake and Natalie, who are a tech and an undergrad at Cornell, so feel free to grab them and ask them really difficult questions after. All right. So I'm going to go over a couple things. I want to give you just an overview of tick-borne diseases, how to identify important ticks if you end up with a tick on you, on your dog, whether to know that's something to be concerned about. The tick-borne diseases in this region specifically, and specifically a lot more about Lyme disease. It is the most prevalent tick-borne disease in the United States. And some prevention and safety for recreating, gardening, and all that kind of stuff. One of the things I want you to take away is that Lyme disease is terrible, but it is preventable, and if you get it, it's treatable. And knowing more about it is really helpful for both of those things. Oh, this is animated. All right. So a couple of important terminology. The vector is the tick. So when we talk about vector-borne disease, it's tick-borne disease. The pathogen is the bacterium, fungi, or parasite that the vector transmits into the human. A reservoir is an animal that's not the human that the pathogen lives in. And the host is you, the human. And so in the case of Lyme disease, the reservoir is mostly small mammals like mice, and the vector is ticks, and the pathogen is a bacterium. And so just a little bit about vector-borne disease ecology. There's all sorts of points in the system in which changes due to humans or other factors can impact the transmission of diseases. So for instance, within the vector, The species matter, the feeding habitat or habits matter, their immunity to the pathogens themselves matters. In regards to the pathogen, the strain can matter or can make a difference. And the environment, which if you stayed for or if you had come for the previous talk, he talked about how deer are overpopulated in New York State. That's a big problem for tick-borne diseases. And the host. So your age can matter. Lyme disease is a lot more impactful for very young or very old individuals and immune-compromised individuals. Okay, there's a couple different transmission patterns. This is a little bit in the weeds, but I'll describe a couple. So some pathogens can be transmitted from the female tick to their eggs. Those are the bad ones that are really hard to target. Some can be transmitted while a tick is feeding on an animal at a different spot from one tick to another. That's called co-feeding. And then there's diseases like Lyme disease that can be transmitted from the baby tick all the way through the life cycles, which are larval, nymph, and adult stages, which you can see here. There's a larval tick, a nymphal tick, which feeds on slightly larger animals, and then the adult tick, which will typically feed on humans or deer. Okay, so what is a tick? They kind of look like a spider. Can anybody name like a feature that would be specific to a tick that's not a normal other insect? What?
8 legs.
8 legs, here. Ready?
8.
Yeah, candy. Someone need candy. Yes, that's true. They have 8 legs. I will say the larval ticks only have 6. They're incredibly small, but then when they molt into a nymph, they will have 8 legs, and then an adult has 8 legs as well. And their mouth is really gross. These are their palps. If you know like a spider, you can kind of see their palps. Tick palps kind of stick out right next to the hypostome, which is where they bite you. That goes inside the body. Another thing that differentiates them from a spider, spiders have 8 legs as well, but ticks do not have a segmented body plan. So that's a spider. It's got its little waist. Ticks do not have that. They're just there's like a little disc, like a coin. So, not a spider. Another thing to be really aware of is ticks are very small. So, an adult female will bite, but it's a little easier to see if you've been bit by an adult female. They're a little bit larger. They're about the size of a sunflower seed. But nymphs, right here, are really small. They're about the size of a poppy seed, and they're probably the biggest cause of Lyme disease because they're hard to spot, so people don't know that they've been bit, like Frank described. He didn't know, and so it's hard. Even fully blood-fed, they're very, very small, and they're already infected because they've already had a chance to feed as a larvae. So oftentimes nymphs are infected, but also difficult to find. So here are the 3 species that you need to be concerned about. And we have some cards that you're welcome to take and some other information where you can refer to this, because this isn't easy to memorize and you can keep it on you or keep it handy. But all 3 of these species live in this region. We have got the Ixodes scapularis. This is the black-legged tick, or some people call it deer tick. Sorry. This is the tick that does the most damage. It's the bad one. It transmits the pathogen responsible for Lyme disease, anaplasmosis, which is often a co-infection with Lyme disease, and a number of others, including Powassan virus, which I'll talk about a little bit later. The Amblyomma americanum, or the Lone Star tick, is really easy to identify because it's got this nice little white dot on the back. I think of it as its star. Also transmits a lot of viruses. Not all of these important to this region, but some of them are becoming more prevalent at northern latitudes as climate changes. And then the American dog tick, which is also fairly easy to identify. It's got this really beautiful shield on it that's white and mottled with brown. It's responsible for 2 very important diseases, tularemia and Rocky Mountain spotted fever, both of which aren't really prevalent in this area, but again, they can be. They're just not as common as Lyme disease. And a side note, there are soft ticks. They're rare, but they're really gross. One of the differences, they feed really quickly and they get really large when they feed, and you can see that mouth, the mouth that I showed you on the other tick. It's actually really difficult to see. It's hidden underneath the back. So if you're looking at it from the top, you can't see its head. And as the name describes it, soft, not hard. Okay, so Ixodes scapularis, our black-legged tick, the important one, has a 2 to 3 year life cycle where it lays eggs, molts into larvae, feeds on a number of different animals or hosts, and then moves through this life cycle, becomes a nymph, then an adult. Adult females will feed on deer, and then once they've fed, they drop off and then they lay eggs. So deer are a big problem with spreading Lyme disease because they have really large ranges and they can actually move tick populations far distances. While the tick is on, they'll feed for 5 to 7 days. They can move miles in any direction and drop off and lay about 4,000 eggs. But there is a cycle to them. So if you see here, they're this is color coordinated. I would recommend everybody get a flyer because it'll show you when certain life stages are most prevalent. But you can see here in the fall, right around now, is adult peak. So be careful when you're out hiking. You'll encounter some of the larger ones. And in the summer, the larvae and nymphs peak and they start to actively quest. And that's our term for when they're looking to bite something. They crawl to the top of grass or bushes and they wave their front legs. I wish I could have a video. And they snatch onto fur or clothing as people walk by or deer walk by. It would be kind of cute if they weren't so gross. Some other important diseases in this region are anaplasmosis, which is a bacterium and often transmitted at the same time as Lyme disease. Tularemia, which is actually got a really interesting transmission. It can actually be aerosolized during hunting and also transmitted by ticks and horseflies. Ehrlichiosis and Rocky Mountain spotted fever. And you can see these maps. You can see sort of the distribution of cases. Tularemia is super rare, but it's kind of everywhere. It rises up kind of anywhere in the country, whereas anaplasmosis is really prevalent in the exact same sort of area as Lyme disease, which is the northeast and the upper Midwest, which is very similar to Lyme disease. Lyme disease is a little bit more prevalent than that. Ehrlichiosis is the mid-south, and Rocky Mountain spotted fever rickettsiosis is sort of in also the south more. Okay, a little bit of history of Lyme disease. Could anybody tell me who discovered Lyme disease? Yes.
Lyme, Connecticut.
It was in Lyme. I'm going to give you candy.
Oh, and something on Long Island, it's called Montauk's knee. It was prevalent down in Long Island, also
Yeah.
the grasses.
Yeah. So
I don't know who though.
it was originally called an arthritis because it was showing up as like the symptoms of arthritis, but in very young children. 5 and 7-year-olds just typically do not have arthritis, so it's alarming. The name of the scientist who discovered the pathogen was named Willy Bergdorfer, which I think is fantastic, which is why the pathogen is called Bergdorferi. We'll just call it Lyme from here on out. But it's been pretty recent that this has been discovered. In the mid-70s is when these symptoms became to be prevalent, and the pathogen was discovered in 1982, which is the year I was born. Since it was discovered, it has just spread massively across the Northeast. One of the big drivers of that is our land use. Again, if you had been here for the previous talk, land use was a big talk, big part of that talk. But second growth forest has created an enormous amount of space for deer, and deer are one of the primary reasons why ticks are expanding in area. So you can see here, This is trying to remember how many years. This is from 1907 to 2015, the expansion of the different ticks that can carry Lyme disease. So you can see how the tick population has expanded, and it's pretty much prevalent in the entire Northeast now. Also on the West Coast we have Ixodes pacificus, which can also transmit Lyme disease, but it's a lot less prevalent there. It's more in very specific habitats that the average person doesn't come into contact with. Unfortunately, in the Northeast, that's not the case. You can come in contact with black-legged tick habitat in your front yard, in your backyard, on your way to work, letting your kids play. It's a problem. So what exactly is it? One of the major signs of Lyme disease is the erythema migrans, which is the rash here. We call it a bullseye rash. You can kind of see that the center is where the tick bites, and then the inflammation of the spirochetes expanding away from that site causes an inflammation, a rash that's visible. You can see on darker skin, well, you really can see it on this, you can't see anything. It's a little harder to identify, harder to see. Only about 70 to 80% of people get this rash. And because of the places in which ticks typically bite, if a person isn't seen by another, felt like a spouse or a parent, they might not know it's there at all because it can be on the back often. And so that's a problem. So a lot of Lyme disease cases go undiagnosed. Some of the other symptoms, severe headaches and neck stiffness are one of the most common symptoms. After a month or two, you'll start getting really intense joint pain. In really terrible or serious cases, as Frank had mentioned, there can be heart problems, heart palpitations. That's extremely rare, but it does happen. And general inflammation, brain fogginess. Most people identify just being really, really exhausted, just like brain fog, achiness, that kind of thing. Now, hopefully you can catch it before those symptoms. This is months after exposure. So hopefully you can catch the tick bite earlier than that. So I want to touch on lab diagnostics. I don't know if anybody here is very aware of the lab diagnostic process for Lyme disease. Many people have claimed that it's not very precise. That's not exactly true. What it is its timing is really important with the lab diagnostic. So if you get bit by a tick and you go into the doctor and you say, oh my God, I got bit by a tick, I think I might have Lyme disease, and they take your blood, then it's going to come up negative, whether you've got Lyme disease or not. Because if you'll remember, when they first bite, they're at that bite site and slowly moving away. Your body's not having the immune reaction. And luckily, we all have a little bit of a primer on infectious disease now because of COVID. Silver lining to that. You'll know that when you have an immune reaction, you can test for a pathogen or you can test for your antibodies. And the lab diagnostics for Lyme disease is antibodies. And so you have to wait until those actually build in the blood. So that's actually, if you look right here, it's about 6 to 9 weeks that test will be positive. And so people will say, I got a negative diagnostic, so it was faulty. But we need to know when to test to get the proper diagnostics. When it's tested at the right time, we have a really good testing system. So, what do you do if you've been bit by a tick, you don't have symptoms yet, and you can't do a diagnostic yet because it's not early enough, but you want to get rid of this pathogen before it starts replicating? So the CDC has a post-exposure prophylactic recommendation where if you get bit by the right tick in the right location where it's likely that tick had Lyme disease, it's been feeding on you long enough to transmit it, they will just give antibiotics to prevent the pathogen from going any further. And that's recommended. And I'll go into that a little bit further in the future. Some of the things that they use to determine is the time of year. So there's a time of year where there's a common disease onset. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that we have seen Lyme disease in the middle of the winter because ticks will actually start questing if it gets above 40 degrees. So if you have an unseasonably warm period in the winter, we'll see Lyme disease cases start to crop up outside of this. And so we need doctors to be really aware of the life cycle and activity of the ticks, as well as these typical parameters for the disease. This is just a little bit of research that's been happening recently around Lyme disease. One of the things that I love about this field is that there's always a lot to learn. So we found that there are ticks that can transmit Lyme disease all over the eastern United States. You can see here, this is the Ixodes scapularis distribution. But the human cases of Lyme disease do not match it completely. This is where Lyme disease is primarily, and there's a ton of Ixodes scapularis down here. And so this has always been a question. Why are we not seeing, and they're infected with Lyme disease down here. They're just not giving it to humans. And recently it was found that the southern clade of Ixodes scapularis, the black-legged tick, feeds on amphibians a lot more often than in the north. And amphibians are not infected with Lyme disease often, or they have properties in their blood that can actually rid the tick of the Lyme pathogen. Super interesting. So this was, I believe, 2 years ago this was published. Also, we have another pathogen that I hadn't mentioned yet, which is babesiosis, or Babesia microti. This is like a tick-borne malaria-like illness. It's a parasite. And it seems that where Lyme disease pathogen is high, it actually increases the transmission of Babesia. So while we see Lyme disease moving into new areas, Babesia microti follows really soon, and it tends to infect easier if the Lyme disease pathogen is present.